So thank you and welcome to Kurukulla Center. What we'll do is start in a traditional way. I think some of you I know recognize some of you as Buddhist students already, and some of you might be new. The way we usually begin our classes is taking a few minutes to set our motivation. So let's do that, and then we'll recite one of the prayers on page 7 of your white prayer book, the Refuge in Bodhicitta prayer, to begin. So let's just take a minute before we recite that prayer to set our intention, set our motivation. And so we say that if we set our intention for an activity, for a spiritual activity, whether it's a class or a meditation session or even a study period, we get more out of it. We've sort of set ourselves up, made our aim clear. So take a moment and just reflect on your motivation for coming to this class on karma and emptiness. So it might be that you're brand new and you've been interested in Buddhist ideas for some time, and this seems like a way to get a good, clear explanation of some of the basic Buddhist principles. It might be that you're perhaps going through a hard time in your life right now and looking for some clarity, something that will maybe help you see things in a different perspective. It might be that you're an advanced Buddhist student. You've been coming to classes here or at another center for a while, and you're just looking to deepen your understanding of this subject. So whatever it might be, whatever your motivation might be, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just about taking a moment to get clear about your intention, your motivation. And then let's recite this Refuge in Bodhicitta verse three times, the one at the top of page 7. In the Buddhas, Dharma, and Sangha, until enlightened, I seek refuge through merit from giving and the rest. To aid all, may I become Buddha. In the Buddhas, Dharma, and Sangha, until enlightened, I seek refuge through merit from giving and the rest. To aid all, may I become Buddha. In the Buddhas, Dharma, and Sangha, until enlightened, I seek refuge. Through merit from giving and the rest, to aid all, may I become Buddha. Okay. So, many years ago in California, I was attending a teaching by a very, very senior and learned Lama called Choden Rinpoche. I don't know if Choden, did he ever come here to teach? Okay, so some of you know Choden Rinpoche. And in this teaching, one of the students said, how do you know that your teacher is qualified? And I was kind of expecting, the 10 qualities of a guru from the Lam Rim or some answer like that. I thought I knew what he was going to say. Of course, I was completely off base, because what he did say was, if your teacher teaches the relationship between karma and emptiness. And that was unexpected to me, and I thought it was just brilliant. I was like, wow, what a great answer. And I think I took it as a bit of a personal mandate to never forget to do that in my own teachings. And at that point, I had that relationship really emphasized to me with, many of my teachers. And then right after that, I was asked to do a course, and talking to the organizers about what to do, I said, well, it would be really interesting to talk about karma and emptiness, and then the 12 links of dependent origination, and how all of it fits together to create our reality. And the organizer's like, yeah, awesome, let's do that. So I kind of developed this course, all of the heaviest subjects in Buddhism to try and cope with it in a weekend is like very daunting and probably a little bit crazy. But anyway, in a simplified way, because karma and emptiness are two subjects that I find are so easily completely misunderstood, right? Kind of difficult to get good explanations. We have ideas that just kind of come from the language. You think karma, and in fact, even in the Oxford English Dictionary, now karma is an English word, and the proof of that is that it's in the Oxford English Dictionary. Apparently that makes something an English word. And the definition is something like destiny or fate, right? And this is sort of the new agey idea of what karma means, which is really not the Buddhist idea of what karma means at all, but that's kind of the general thinking about karma is, forget about changing your life much because it's just your karma, boom. Your destiny, it's like stamped in, and that's not the Buddhist idea of karma. So there are a lot of misunderstandings about karma. And then emptiness, so many misunderstandings, mostly because of the translation, shunyata, emptiness. It's like some black hole, and then the goal of the spiritual path is to somehow merge into this like nothingness, and then you go, whoa, that sounds freaky. I don't think I want to do that at all. What's that all about? Not at all what it means, but again, the language, the translation is a problem, incomplete explanations are a problem, so I'll do my best to clarify not only some of these misconceptions, but to talk about the relationship between the two, and then to relate both of them to the 12 links of dependent origination. I met Ed this afternoon in the kitchen when he so kindly came to drop off vegetables, I think, for Geshe Tenle, and I said to him, after all, the 12 links is what the Buddha realized under the Bodhi tree that fateful night. It's a little important to understand, And I find sometimes, for me, when I first started studying Buddhism in the Tibetan tradition, I was shown this diagram with a monkey leaping around the branches of a tree and a boat with some people in it and some house with empty windows, and it was like, wait, what? And what does this have to do with anything? And, it was just very complicated, and I never really understood kind of how does this relate to my life? And how does this relate to how I create my unenlightened existence? Because that's really what the 12 links is trying to tell us. And how do we break through? That's the point. And then I did some long meditations retreats many years later and felt like I got a bit of an epiphany about the 12 links in long meditation retreats. So I'm going to try and transmit as much as possible that epiphany to you. Now, when I start talking about the 12 links, I get really excited and I have to stand up and jump up and down next to the flip chart. So I'll take the microphone off the stand when it gets to that point. But it's very, very cool. It's very, very cool because it really explains everything. I mean, the essence of Buddhism and the 12 links is a diagram that Lord Buddha actually designed to explain everything about the Buddhist path. So we'll get there. I've simplified the diagram because we're all literate. We don't need the little pictures, or at least I'm making an assumption that everybody in this room knows how to read and write. Can I have a show of hands? Does everybody know how to read and write? At least one language, right? Like kind of American, even if not English. So anyway, very simple. So we'll look at all of that this weekend. We'll also do a karma quiz, which will show us what our experiences are that we're having now and what the karmic cause of those experiences is, so that we can design a personal karmic purification game plan, which is also really important. So I'm all about being practical. So hopefully over the course of the weekend, I'll give you a lot of practical tips of things that you can really use, like today, in your life, to suffer less, because that's really the only reason that Lord Buddha taught anything, is so that we would suffer less. And if our Dharma study and our Dharma practice isn't enabling us to suffer less, we're missing the point completely. And I think that this topic, really hits all of the essential points of how we can really make this practice, very practical. So after that, setting the bar really high for myself, but I just wanted to kind of give you all bit of a preview of kind of coming attractions and what we're going to do over the weekend. So for all of you, if you can attend all the sessions, I know it's a big time commitment. We start tomorrow morning at 10, is it? And go until 5 with the potluck lunch break. And then Sunday also 10 to 3. So I know it's a big time commitment, but if you can attend, because it will be very progressive. And if you skip anything, you know, you'll just miss some chunks that might be really, really important, especially for Sunday morning. I'll be talking about emptiness, and this is something that, because it's so easily misunderstood, it's important to try and kind of be there for the whole explanation, because if you miss bits and pieces, really easily to get confused and to have it be misunderstood, okay? Now, you got a little booklet with a lot of the notes of the things that I'm going to be going over. I've got flip chart pages, but a lot of what's going to be up here, these are yours to keep. So you're also welcome to, you know, make notes on this handout as well. So this will have a lot of the kind of charts and diagrams and things that I'm going to be going through. So what we'll do, we'll start with karma first. Well, we're going to even start before karma with the Four Noble Truths, right? Because that's kind of the framework of everything that Lord Buddha taught. I always think it's really important to show how whatever subject matter we're approaching fits into the framework of the Four Noble Truths, right? Because otherwise, we don't quite know where we are in the path. We don't quite know kind of the context of what we're talking about. So we'll talk about the Four Noble Truths. Just for a lot of you, I know it might be a review, and then we're going to get into a lot of the details of karma. And the details of karma that we're going to be looking at come from a text, and this is right here in the first page of your notes, called the Abhidharma Kosha, which is sometimes translated as Treasury of Higher Knowledge, by a great Indian master called Master Vasubandhu, who lived in 350 AD. And some of you who've studied might be familiar with the names of Master Vasubandhu and Master Asanga. Anybody heard the name Asanga in your studies? They were half-brothers, and they were responsible for most of the major texts that are studied in the Tibetan monasteries. So these two brothers were amazing, like really produced a lot of these texts. And it was an interesting story. Their mother had been a nun, and she was also a great meditator and a highly realized being, and she had some kind of visionary experience where she was told by, you know, a Buddha emanation, oh, it would be more beneficial actually if you disrobed and had these two sons that would end up being these great teachers. Of course, back in the day, women couldn't be great teachers, but you could have sons that would end up being great teachers. I don't think she would have been told that. Hopefully not in the 21st century, but that's the way the story goes. And then her two sons were Master Asanga and Master Vasubandhu, and it turned out to be true that they ended up being responsible for many of the Buddhist texts. So the Abhidharma Kosha, Treasury of Higher Knowledge, when we look at what we call the three baskets, or the three collections of the Buddhist teachings, we talk about the sutra basket. Many of us are familiar with the word sutra, and that refers to the discourses of the Buddha. So that collection of teachings of discourses is, you know, often the sutras will begin, oh, the Buddha, you know, after the alms round and the meal, then was requested to teach by one of the monastics or one of the lay people in the entourage, and gave a teaching to the whole group of people. Sometimes the sutras or the discourses are just a conversation that Lord Buddha had with one person who came to see him to ask a question. So some of them are, often it would be a Brahmin or a Jain who would come challenge the Buddha and ask a question and say, what do you think about this? And then the Buddha's answer is a sutra. So that's one collection of teachings. And then we've got the Vinaya, a collection of teachings on vowed morality, mostly monastic discipline, but also morality for lay people. Some of you are familiar with the 5 lay vows that also are taught in that collection of teachings of the Vinaya. And then the Abhidharma is the third collection of teachings, and that's higher knowledge or manifest knowledge. So all the teachings on Buddhist cosmology, for example, Buddhist psychology. I know some of you are studying awarenesses and knowers right now, this class with Geshe Tinley. All of that detail comes from the Abhidharma, from that collection of manifest knowledge. And all of the teachings on karma also come from that collection. Now, much later, Master Vasubandhu, there's 17 great treatises of Abhidharma. Lucky for us, we don't have to read all 17, because Master Vasubandhu compiled them all into this treasury of higher knowledge, right? So it's kind of a compilation, the Abhidharma greatest hits, you know, all compiled into one book. And in the 4th chapter of that Abhidharma Kosha is all about karma. So all the details that we're going to be talking about during this class, especially the beginning part, talking about karma, come from that 4th chapter of the Abhidharma Kosha. So if anybody asks you tomorrow what you were studying, you can be really, you know, kind of show your Buddhist street cred and say, I've been studying the 4th chapter of the Abhidharma Kosha, and they'll be really impressed. So. And the opening lines of the 4th chapter of the Abhidharma Kosha, there's one line that's not in your booklet. And the first line is, all of the worlds of the universe come from karma. Karma is intention and what it produces. Intention is mental karma. What it gives rise to is karma of body and speech. So that's the very first stanza of the Abhidharma. All the worlds of this universe come from karma. And karma is intention, a movement of the mind. Just the merest movement of mind is the definition of intention, the mental factor of intention. And what that intention gives rise to, which is actions of body and speech, right? So the rawest, most basic form of karma is just a mental shift, just a subtle shift of mind. And this is one of the debates that Lord Buddha got into when one of these Brahmins came to question him, and they said, what's more important, actions of body and speech or actions of mind? And the Buddha said, mind, of course. And the Brahmins were like, what an idiot. Like, you know, the mind doesn't create anything. It's not like words, it's not actions. But what the Buddha was pointing to is it all begins with mind. It all begins with mind, and with that intention and that subtle, subtle movement of mind. And that's kind of the rawest, most basic form of karma, is that mental intention and what that intention gives rise to, which are actions of speech and actions of body. And we'll be looking at all of that, but it's very cool. And then the first part, all the worlds of the universe are created by karma. And this was taught by Lord Buddha to refute 2 wrong views that were very, very common in India at the time of the Buddha, and I think are 2 views that we definitely have in our culture as well. And one is that the world was created by a supreme being. Sound familiar? In 7 days. I was reading somewhere the percentage, now that it's the election, you know, all of these studies are being done, the percentage of Americans that believe that human beings were created 10,000 years ago on the, what day was it? The 6th day, the 7th day God rested, right? Were humans the 6th day? Anyway, in there somewhere, whatever. That's different religion. I'm not an expert in that one. How many Americans believed, you know, in the Genesis creation story and thought that that happened? If you go back in all of the begats and all the generations, that was about 10,000 years ago, and that's when human beings were created by God. So Lord Buddha refuted, there was a similar idea in India, you know, about a supreme being that created everything and created the world. And so this, you know, verse that, no, it was created by karma, was refuting that view. And then there was another view that I think we hold even a little bit more strongly in the West now. It was also a view in ancient India of everything's just random, just kind of chaotic, right? Everything just happens kind of randomly, and we just are sort of this helpless victim of chaotic, random things coming at us, right? So that's a view that we definitely also hold is like, our only hope is to just sort of fend off and cope and somehow manage chaotic random events just coming at us, and we're just kind of a helpless victim. And this was also a view. There was a philosophical school in ancient India called the Charvakas, and they thought that everything was random, that there was no such thing as cause and effect. And so this is a view that was held back then, and I think it's a view that's held now. Scientific reductionists, and there is no such thing as mind. It's just sort of epiphenomenon of brain function, and there's certainly nothing like cause and effect. It's just, what we can perceive with the five senses, and so you just cope or check out, or somehow deal with this crazy random chaos. Fortunately, not a Buddhist view. So the Buddhist view is there's cause and effect, and we create causes for everything that we experience. We actually even created a cause for the world that we live in. So we'll look at that in a lot of detail. How does that work? But that's what the Buddha was talking about. And then he said, it's just this very, very basic intention, this movement of mind, and then the actions that follow from that movement of mind. That's another wrong view about karma, along with that view that it means something like fate or destiny. A lot of people use the word karma to refer to the result, not the cause. But karma, literally, the word karma in Sanskrit means action. So it's referring to the cause, not the result. We can say the result of karma, but when you say, oh, that person is homeless because it's their karma to be homeless. Well, yeah, maybe also it's their karma to have a compassionate person walk past and help them. Ever think of that? It's not like, oh no, there's nothing you can do, it's their karma. Wrong view, according to Buddhism. Yeah, it's their karma too, to have somebody. Now, will it work or not? That also depends on your karma. You can try and help somebody. Will it work or not? And that's the difference between causes and conditions, and we'll talk about that a lot more, right? But those wrong views. So the Buddha was refuting those wrong views when he said, the basic thing is, our world is created by karma, and karma is intention, and that which is produced by intention. So that was refuting those wrong views. And like I said, we've got those, we've got others too, but those are the pretty much the main ones, the supreme being idea and the random idea. Are there any other kind of contenders for views of why things happen the way that they do, in addition to those? Are there any other big contenders? The omnipotent supreme being thing and the random thing, and then the karma thing, which is what Buddhism says the explanation is. Sometimes when I'm teaching a class over time, I give this as a discussion group question. Can you think of any other, explanations for why things happen the way they do? But it's usually those are the three, and the cause and effect one is the one that Buddhism says is the correct one. Okay. So let's backtrack a little bit. This is the source of the teachings on karma, but let's look now at the context of the Four Noble Truths and see where the teachings on karma fit in there, because that'll give us a context. And because I haven't been here since that really gnarly snowstorm in February of 2016, remember that one that Logan Airport closed? Was it 15? Oh, we're on 16 now. Duh. Yeah, trust me. 2015. And I was stranded, and I'd never seen so much snow, and we were out there shoveling, and I'm really tall, and I couldn't see over when I was walking down the sidewalk. So that's how long ago it's been since I've been here. So I know some of you are very familiar. Is there anybody absolutely, completely brand new to Buddhism? This is kind of your first. Don't be shy. Anybody? Okay. So, have you all familiar with the Four Noble Truths? More or less. Anybody feel kind of not completely comfortably familiar with the Four Noble Truths? Okay. And then for the rest of you, it'll be a review. It's always good to review, because this is something, like I say, His Holiness the Dalai Lama always really emphasizes putting everything within the context of the Four Noble Truths. Sometimes in Tibetan Buddhism, we don't always emphasize that as much, and sometimes you're like, wait, where are we, in this thing? So it's not a bad idea to sort of look at that. So let's take a look. And some of you that were here during the gnarly snowstorm, I think I taught a whole weekend on the Four Noble Truths. I can't quite remember back then. So you might be familiar with this, but it's been a long time. And many seasons have passed between now and then, so we'll review. So this is kind of showing the relationship between the first so-called noble truth, the truth of suffering, and the truth of the origin of suffering. So what are the Four Noble Truths? I just gave away the first two. The truth of suffering, and we'll talk about that word, not a good translation. The origin, so that's talking about the causes of our disappointing experiences. And what are the last two? Yeah, cessation, and then the path leading to the cessation, right? So we start with the truth of suffering. Not that that's how things begin, but Lord Buddha used this great sort of metaphor of going to see a doctor. And he said, before you go to see a doctor to get the medicine, you need to know that something's wrong. Like, that's the first step. You're not going to seek help unless you know that something's wrong. So that's why the truth of so-called suffering comes first, because we need to understand. If we thought that everything is just going swimmingly and everything's always perfect and it goes like you guys probably wouldn't be here on Friday night. You'd be out there having your perfect life, that everything's going swimmingly in. I won't get personal, but usually when people show up at Buddhist teachings, it means they have kind of a clue about this one, and they've experienced a little bit of disappointment, which might be why more people come in middle age. I think the 21-year-olds, I don't know, you're probably the youngest person in here, I won't ask how young. Often it's the younger people like, oh no, the world is my oyster, I've got my whole life and it's going to be awesome. And then by the time you're, I don't know, mid-30s, you're kind of like, oh wow, okay. It hasn't really worked out. Maybe there's another answer, right? And then the rest of us who are even more on the down slope than that have plenty of bitter experience. But it's the first thing that we need to realize. And that's why I don't really like this word. I think it's very misleading. I use it because, unfortunately, we're stuck with it a little bit because so many of the translations use that word. But it's cool. I really love language and looking at the etymology of the Sanskrit words. So the word that's being translated usually as suffering is dukkha. And it comes from two words in Sanskrit that are kind of a cognate. They're put together, du and akka. And du means something like out of balance, out of kilter, constricted. And then akka literally means space. But this is interesting. It refers to the hole in a wheel that the axle goes through. That's an akka. So one of the Buddhist teachers that I was studying said, it's like this. It's this word that's usually translated as suffering really means something like out of kilter wheel. Now, in the time of Lord Buddha, there were a lot of ox carts. In fact, in India, and these days, there's tons of ox carts. We have the, grocery carts at the Safeway, right? So what happens when you grab one that has the wonky wheel? And you're just trying to get your shopping done, and you're aiming towards the broccoli, and it keeps slamming up into the frozen foods, and you're like, wrestling it, and it's like, I don't want Haagen-Dazs today, I want broccoli. And that's what the Buddha was talking about. He said, we think, even if you have a clue what you think will make you happy, and that's already a big ask, and you're aiming towards it, and what happens? That wonky wheel thing. You just can't steer your life perfectly in the direction that you want. And that's what dukkha is, right? It's not, because sometimes when we think suffering, we're like, oh, broken legs and bitter divorces and, heart attacks. But it's just this thing of like, the Buddha described it like this, much more subtly. You don't get what you want, that's a drag. You get what you don't want, equally also a bummer. Or, this is my personal favorite, you get what you thought you wanted after a lot of work, and then you get it, and you're kind of like, wah, wah. That was pretty dissatisfying. So a lot of people translate this as dissatisfaction. And it's like we always are. There's a thing in Western psychology, I'm trying to remember the phrase for it. It's something about our anticipation of things fools us into thinking that we're getting pleasure from the thing. There's a phrase for it that I'm forgetting right now. I just read it in a book the other day, but it's this thing of like our anticipation of the happiness that we're going to get when we get the thing that keeps us going and keeps us moving towards it, fools us into thinking that the thing made us happy. And generally when we get whatever we're going for, we're a little bit like, that's it? That's dukkha. That's that dissatisfaction. Just that pervasive, we can't quite get it right in our life, and there's always the chance of disappointment, just that subtle, little, oh, it's not quite working. Sort of like we try and get that house of cards perfectly balanced. And then if you do, and you marry your high school sweetheart and you stay madly in love and have a great sex life for like 70 years, and then like the grandchildren are behaving and successful and the roof doesn't leak, somebody's going to die. I mean, it never works out. It never turns out. And usually most of us don't have that story at all, do we? Of like everything just sailing along perfectly until somebody dies. So it's just built in. Anytime we're looking for happiness from the outside, we're going to be disappointed. And that's what this is. So suffering is kind of an intense word. Some translators really like to use the word dissatisfaction, which I think is closer. But it's nice to think of the out-of-kilter wheel thing that's really like the definition. Or another way of translating dukkha is constricted space. And I like to think of this too. When you think of people my age, you might remember, I don't know if kids these days, you can tell me. What's your name, by the way? I'm going to keep picking on you because you're the young one. We had this Play-Doh extruders. Do you guys remember that? And it was this little plastic machine, and then you'd put like the star, and then you'd push the thing, except if you were me, your Play-Doh had dried out and you'd just break the handle. Yeah, did that happen to you too, Ed? That was dukkha, you'd be like, oh dude, I broke my thing. But it would like squish out in this shape, and it's so interesting. We're trying to get huge, all-encompassing reality to fit into this tiny little shape that we've called happiness, isn't it? Like we have our little definition of happiness, and it's just like our little Play-Doh extruder star shape. And we're trying to get this like incredible, beautiful, amazing reality, but we almost can't handle it. We need to squish it into the little constricted space of our little box. And then if you've got a partner and their little box of happiness doesn't overlap enough, or maybe even at all, with your little box, right? So that's another way of thinking of dukkha, is what are we doing? Like we just have such a narrow vision of what's possible often. And the opposite of dukkha is this word sukha, which is often translated as bliss. But what it really means literally is like just wide open space. We're just kind of relating to reality as it really exists in this extremely open way without trying to like squash it into this narrow space. So that's what the Buddha was talking about. Can you relate to it a little bit more than suffering now? Yeah, mostly yeah, because we all sort of have that experience. I have a friend, and those of you who were here a year and a half ago when it snowed, I might have told this story because it's such a perfect story of dukkha. This friend of mine grew up in like a very rough neighborhood in South Central LA, and to get out of the hood, the thing was to become a sports star, right? So he's playing both baseball and football in the vacant lot with his friends. He gets really good. He gets scholarships for college for both sports, because apparently, I mean, I know nothing about it, but they're played at different seasons, so you can play both sports in college, those of you that are, sports people. And then he got recruited for professional teams after college for both sports. And he said he picked football because he loved the sport more. And I'm like, I so don't get football. It's this tiny little ball, and all these guys in like these suits, and they all jump into a pile, and somebody blows a whistle, and then nothing happens for like 20 minutes. And then they do it again for 5 seconds. I mean, LeBron James, I can relate to. It's big ball, he's up in the air, he sails over like the world to, rejection off the glass. I have a friend who's a monk, and he insisted that we watch the NBA finals together this year earlier. That I can relate to. Football, I don't get. Anyway, so my friend decides on football, and he goes to the training camp. And I guess the way it works is like every week, a bunch more than what they really need go to the training camp. And then every week, they sort of weed them out. And so he's telling me this story, and he says, so I remember the morning the coach walked into the locker room with the clipboard and said, congratulations, men. This is the 1991 New Orleans Saints football team. They're all like, whoa, celebrate, party. And he goes, the next day. And then he goes, no, that afternoon. He was like, that's it? The party's over? And he realized nothing much had really changed. This is like this lifelong dream. He'd worked so hard. So he's telling me he had the contract and the big salary and dated Hollywood starlets and had like, $1,000 bills piled up on the coffee table and this whole high life thing. And then the minute his contract was finished, he went to the Bodhi Tree bookstore in Los Angeles and bought all these Buddhist books. And the last time we talked, he was investigating a place to do a 3-year retreat. So sometimes I think people understand this because they've hit bottom. Sometimes because they've hit top. And the top turned out to be pretty disappointing, like my friend, the football star. So sometimes it's like you understand this. I teach in prisons. You don't have to talk about the First Noble Truth for like 5 nanoseconds. They're like, yeah, tell me something I don't know about suffering, so you can skip over. It makes class a lot shorter. You don't really have to talk much about it. But sometimes I think it's through having hit, the top, and the top having been disappointing. So the truth of suffering, and then the origin. So we're going to be talking a lot about the origin, both in terms of karma and the first step, ignorance. But let's look at this. So we say ignorance starts everything off. You will find ignorance at the top of many Buddhist flow charts, as you may have encountered already. So what kind of ignorance is this, do you think? It's a very specific kind of flavor of ignorance. It's a, very specific type. Anybody have any guesses? 2 flavors, actually, of this ignorance. And what's your name? Doug. Yes. Yeah. So in Buddhism, we say that there's this big ignorance about the way that we and everything else also exists. We think that things exist exactly in the way that they appear to us. So there's a dichotomy between the appearance, which we believe to be the way things exist, and the way things really exist, right? So that's this, and it's a long story, and we'll get there Sunday morning especially. That's going to be the topic for most of Sunday, is how do we reduce and eventually completely eliminate that dichotomy? We believe in the appearance of us and of everything else. The big problem is our belief in the way that we exist, which is so limiting, and we'll look at that a lot. And also we believe sort of that helpless victim of self-existent reality thing we were talking about before. We think we're just going around and everything exists exactly the way it appears to us, and then we're just kind of like dealing with it. Whereas in Buddhism we say our mind co-creates our reality. In fact, has a big job at creating the reality that we experience, which is the connection between karma and emptiness. So I'll just give you a little teaser right there so you come back tomorrow to get more of the details, but that's the Buddhist view, is there is no such dichotomy between, there is for us just due to our ignorance, right? So that's a huge problem, which is why it always shows up at the top of every flowchart. In the Mahayana tradition, we really emphasize ignorance. Sometimes we say ignorance is the root of samsara. Samsara, another Sanskrit vocabulary word that refers to the Buddhist idea that we're reborn over and over and over and over and over again, uncontrolled due to the forces of karma and delusion. So the point of Buddhism is to get free of that uncontrolled rebirth, and we'll look at that more when we look at the 12 links. But it's ignorance that got us there, right, in that cycle of uncontrolled rebirth. Now, in the Theravada, the Southern Buddhist tradition, the Pali tradition, they emphasize more that the root of samsara is attachment, which is mostly true. Attachment is a huge part of the problem, probably our predominant mental affliction. So it's mostly true, but we go one step back more in the Sanskrit tradition and really emphasize that root ignorance, or that misunderstanding about how things exist, especially us. So that's one part of ignorance. There's another kind of ignorance that we also say is super problematic. Yeah, Lori?
Is that the ignorance of causality?
Yeah. That's right. So just what we were talking about before it, ignorance about cause and effect, thinking that things are random, thinking that God's testing us or punishing us or whatever the story is, right? So an ignorance about the law of cause and effect. Also hugely problematic, because if we don't think that our actions actually lead to results, then sex, drugs, and rock and roll, eat, drink, and be merry, whatever. What are we doing sitting here? Why sit cross-legged and our knees hurt and it's just, So, ignorance about that there is such a thing as cause and effect, which cause and effect explains all of Buddhism, like why we do Buddhist practice, right? So yeah, those are the two kind of flavors of ignorance that we're going to be looking at. Ignorance about the nature of reality and ignorance about the law of cause and effect. And we say that those lead to mental afflictions, okay? Those of you, and I think I didn't correct it, and I apologize for that. This diagram is on page 2 of your handout, and I've called the second one disturbing emotions, but that's actually not accurate. And those of you who were here the last couple of days know I made a big point of that. But mental affliction is a much better translation of the Sanskrit word, which is klesha. And it's defined as any thought that's disturbing to our peace of mind. So that's the definition of a mental affliction. Any thought that's disturbing to our peace of mind. In the text on Buddhist psychology, there's 26 of these mental afflictions, okay, and some of you may have studied that. They're all a combination of what we call the 3 poisons. Anybody heard that phrase, the 3 poisons or 3 poisonous minds of ignorance, attachment, and aversion? So we're going to look at those 3 because we don't have time to do a whole class on all 26. But the 26, it's interesting in the text on Buddhist psychology, each one of them is a recipe. There's a recipe for each one of what combination of ignorance, attachment, and aversion they are. For example, jealousy. 2 parts attachment, 1 part aversion, and a healthy sprinkling of ignorance, to taste, right? So they're all some combination of the 3 main ones of ignorance, attachment, and aversion. So we'll look at all of those. But it is interesting to look at that list of 26 mental afflictions coming from the text on Buddhist psychology. Has anybody studied those mental, or the 51 mental factors? Anybody done that study? Okay, I didn't know if they'd done that here before. Very interesting. Have you, Ed? Okay. Yeah. So on there is the thing that we mostly do think of as a disturbing emotion, which is why I used to use that translation. Things like jealousy, pride, anger, belligerence. There's all these flavors of anger. In that list of 26, like everything from kind of the annoyance, irritation side to belligerence, which is pretty bad, and kind of everything in between. There's a couple of different flavors of attachment in there as well, and then some of the other ones. And then it's interesting when you look, and for those of you that were in the classes on Wednesday and Thursday, when we look at the mental afflictions, the reason I now don't use the phrase disturbing emotions is because those aren't really what we think of when we think of the word emotion in English. And it's more focused on what's going to mess up your meditation. That's the emphasis when we're looking at the mental afflictions. When you think of it, any thought that's disturbing to your peace of mind, so you won't be able to meditate well. It's not thinking so much about the harm to others, even though, of course, that's in there for sure. But there's some things in there like mental dullness. That's not really a disturbing emotion. It's not really going to hurt anybody, but it's sure going to mess up your meditation. Also, excitement, distraction about pleasant sense objects. Anybody ever have that come up in your meditation? Super disturbing. Who cares if you're sitting there fantasizing about your vacation or your new boyfriend? That's not going to hurt anybody. But it's totally going to ruin your meditation. So there are a lot of things on that list that if we're really thinking about a destructive or disturbing emotion, you're like, what's that on there for? But think about it in terms of your meditation. And then a lot of them really are what we think of as disturbing emotions that are harmful to others, like the belligerence, jealousy, ones like that. So ignorance, attachment, and aversion. And let's look at attachment and aversion, and then we'll take a little break. So if you need a break, we'll have one in a couple of minutes. Now, the definition of attachment is interesting, and we're going to define it very precisely, because this is another thing that's really misunderstood. And there's a Buddhist rumor that if you're a good Buddhist, you're not supposed to really like anything much, right? And you're supposed to kind of be like stoic and detached. Oh, chocolate. Oh, no. Chocolate, cucumbers, like whatever. I don't care. Fruit cake, anything. Doesn't matter. Somehow you're supposed to be stoic and non-reactive. And enlightened beings are somehow just sitting there like kind of stoic with this look on their face. No. That's not what, trying to overcome attachment. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who's the perfect example of somebody who's not just sitting there non-reactive, he's just kind of like, just digging everything, right? So, important to be really precise. Attachment does not mean liking things. It doesn't even mean wanting things, because we can want things that are really smart. Do enlightened beings really want all beings to be free of suffering? Passionately. You bet. So it doesn't mean that you can't be energized and passionate and desire things with wisdom, right? Putting cause and effect into play. So the definition of attachment, it's got a couple of components. So perceiving an object as pleasant, that's the first part. So the object could be a person, it could be some inanimate object like a possession, could even be a concept or even an event, some kind of situation. So any of those, you're perceiving it as pleasant. Then the next step, you exaggerate the attractive aspects of that object. And then the third step, you think that by possessing and retaining that object, you'll have lasting happiness. Sounds like a setup for what? Total dukkha, right? I mean, we just completely set ourselves up. That object out there is pleasant, and then it's like perfect. And then if I could only have it and keep it forever, then we'd live happily ever after. And at this point I usually ask for a show of hands. Anybody ever fallen in love? Now come on, the Buddhist nun should not be the only one, like raising her hand. So what happens? I remember, it's so embarrassing, like you think back, I remember one time I think it was like the early 80s, long before I was a nun, just want to make that completely clear. The new boyfriend, and then you start going out, and then there's always phase where you just joined at the hip, and then you want to introduce him to all your friends. Next stage, right? So you go to the party and you're like, you know, and introducing him, and you want all your friends to also go, wow, you know. Not too much, not that he likes them more than, you know, but you do want them to get that he's, you know. And then the next day you're checking with your friends, right? And you're kind of go, somebody's been there, right? So you're checking the next day and you're like, what did you think? Isn't he awesome? And your friend is like, yeah, honey, he seems really nice, you know. I'm glad you're happy. Do you want to go to the movie at 7? And you're like, no, but isn't he amazing? And they're like, yeah, he's really nice. Let's go have pizza first, and then you think all your friends are like blind and stupid, don't you? Until 6 months later, after you've moved in, and he leaves the toilet seat up in the middle of the night, and then you fall in, and then you can't stand the way he chews his food, and then what do you say? You're not the person I fell in love with. I had a Buddhist boyfriend once, and when I got to the point of, you're not the person I fell in love with, he's like, yeah, because you fell in love with your projection. You fell in love with your hallucination. It was like, great, I'm never dating a Buddhist ever again. They totally bust you on, like, wah. Yeah, guess so. That's the nature of attachment. So that sounds like a setup for disaster. So it's not about preferring chocolate to cucumbers. It's not about wanting all sentient beings to be happy. It's not about like going out of your way to get tickets for the Dalai Lama. All that's fine if it's done with wisdom. But you can see how ignorance is completely embedded into that definition of attachment, can't you? Just like, you perceive it as attractive. Okay, that's the first step. We perceive things as attractive, no big deal. But then that exaggeration, and then that wrong view of, I've got to have it and never let it go. And it's going to last forever. I mean, so much ignorance in the happily ever after part, right? Because things are changing moment by moment by moment. Nothing lasts forever, even if it does, seem to be a condition for your happiness, but it's not going to last. So having a more realistic view, then we can enjoy stuff. And you just look at His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who seems to enjoy everything. I mean, I don't know what's going on, but he is. He's just like, I remember a friend of mine who took his Lama, he took his Tibetan Lama. There was one of those like free Tibet events of like Tibetan, freedom thing. And it was, I think it was in New York, and His Holiness was there, and like Harrison Ford, who's a big like free Tibet supporter. My friend took his elderly Tibetan Lama, and they're sitting there, and Harrison Ford comes on the stage, and this Lama goes, look, it's Indiana Jones. And then Richie Havens. Does anybody remember Richie Havens, right? So Richie Havens come on. I don't know if he ever had an album, because he really only had the one song, right? So he comes out and he's like, freedom, freedom. And His Holiness is sitting on stage going, like he probably has no idea. I mean, half the time he's at those events and you're like, he has no idea what's going on. But he's just like, okay, it's something, and they're all happy, so yeah. And Richie Havens, and he just is enjoying everything, like all the time. But you don't get the feeling when he's being driven from his hotel, his really nice hotel that the sponsors like put him in this beautiful place, and they're driving him to JFK after the event, and he's looking over his shoulder going, oh, that was nice, when is that going to happen again? There's none of that grasping at all. It's like he can 100% enjoy and then just let it go. So there's no problem in enjoying things. But for us, so often, our enjoyment is like super mixed with attachment that it's hard for us. It's like we have the Velcro instead of Teflon attitude towards our objects of enjoyment, don't we? Whereas you see somebody like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, apparently Lama Yeshe was like that. I had a friend who was Lama Yeshe's attendant, and he would tell me these stories about Lama Yeshe, who just loved everything. At one point, Lama Yeshe went to a gardening class. He was really into gardening, so he goes to this gardening class at the local community college with all the 21-year-olds. My friend said, He didn't wear his robes to class. My friend is like, he was from New York, and he's like, he wore this thing that was kind of like a red shift, like a muumuu that he wore to gardening class. And the last day of class, Lama Yeshe comes out, trailed by all the 21-year-olds. The last day of gardening class, instead of bringing the teacher presents, they brought Lama Yeshe all these gifts. So Lama Yeshe's like, well, apparently he was so joyful and just loved life so much. So it's not that it's a problem of enjoying things, but the attachment that comes from the ignorance is the part that's really problematic. And then aversion, and then we'll take a break. Aversion, same kind of definition, just 180 degrees opposite. So what do you think the definition of aversion is? Well, that's one of the kind of flavors of how aversion can manifest, but thinking of the definition of attachment. Yeah. Yeah. So we're perceiving something as unpleasant, and then we're exaggerating the unpleasant qualities of that object and thinking, if I never see it again, then I'll be happy, right? The horrible boss. And you don't even understand why he's married and goes out with his friends on Friday night, like for beers. Because who could stand to be around him for 5 seconds more than they had to? And his kids run in to work, after school and climb in his lap and go, daddy, daddy, kiss him on the cheek. And you're, he's just, So that's aversion. Same thing, just that total exaggeration. You're seeing things just with one flavor that's so exaggerated, and you think, And then what happens? You quit your job, and then your karma follows you to the next situation. We'll get into that more, but... So this is, you can see how for both of these, and these are kind of the main flavors, right, of the mental afflictions, is like the clinging attachment side and then the aversion side, and how much of the ignorance about the nature of reality is built in, and we'll talk more about that. And then the mental afflictions don't always give rise to a karmic action, but often can, right? So if we've got one of these going on, can often give rise to a karmic action. So let's take a break for about 10 minutes. Let's come back at 6 minutes after 8. Is that right? Ish, more or less. And then we'll finish talking about this, and then we'll start talking about some of the ways that karma works. All right, have a break. Well, I grew up all over the place. I'm American originally, but lived kind of all over, and now I live in near Santa Cruz in California. We have a Buddhist center up in the mountains, and so that's where I'm living now in the residency.
And when you say you grew up all over the place, why your parents just moved?
My father was in the military, so we moved. I say every 15 minutes. It was more like every year and a half until I got into high school. And we lived, the first 4 years, I was just talking to Les because he lived in Egypt for a number of years. The first 4 years of my life I lived in Egypt. So Arabic was my first language, actually. And I wish I remembered. I don't remember anything. But apparently my pronunciation was really good because it was that influence. Then we lived in Denmark for a while, but the rest of the time in the States. Where are you from?
Ecuador.
Oh, Ecuador. Okay.
I've been here most of my life.
Oh, have you?
Never lost my accent. Once you get past 13, 14.
Yeah, they say it's
When I was
really
early
hard.
20s, like.
Or you have to work at it really hard, and why bother? But I think people can if they really want.
I wish we didn't have an accent here.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, yeah. They don't have to look at my face. I'm on the phone and.
Yeah. I've never been to Ecuador, but we have a center in Colombia that I've been a couple of times in Bogota, and it's just so beautiful there. I couldn't believe it. When I first went to Colombia, I had no idea what the countryside was, but it's it's up in the Andes, you know, it's like
Yeah.
Bogota is really high. I went in August and I'm thinking, oh, South America in August it's going to be hot. It's freezing. Because it was, you know, so
Yeah,
much
same in
altitude.
Ecuador.
Yeah.
Here towards the coast.
Then it's hot and
It's
like
hot.
humid, but up in the
Yeah, but it depends. Not even half of the year very hot and humid.
Yeah.
The rest of the year it's just good.
Yeah.
It's like eternal spring.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, no.
But then you go to the mountains and it can get really hot. Yeah, really cold. Yeah.
Do you go back? Do you still have family?
All the years that I've been here since 1969, I only went back 6 years ago.
Really? For the first time? Wow. Was it really
Here, and then, you know, even relatives, everybody comes here. So,
Was it it must have been so different.
yeah.
Did you remember really
Oh,
anything?
yes.
Did
I
you?
remember
Did
the
you?
house.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could have gone on my own to the house where I lived,
Oh,
at my
wow.
school, and yeah, and it was nice to see my high school friends.
Oh my
and,
gosh,
yeah, we all
that
got
must have been
together.
great.
And I love Facebook because Facebook.
Yeah, you can keep in touch with everybody. Oh,
I'm a
isn't
big
that
fan.
great? Oh, yeah, yeah.
You can keep.
That's right. And you just, and you don't have to like send personal emails, but if you just want to know how somebody's doing, you just look on their
Yeah.
I didn't do Facebook for the longest time, and then I started doing it about a year and a half ago. But mostly I have a public page, and I put all my social justice things and my prison work and all of that kind of on there. And also my teaching schedule too, because, you know, people like, I mean, I don't put personal things, but then for my other friends, it is nice to know, oh, where are they, what are they doing right now, and where are they, and where did they go on holiday, because it's just too hard to keep up with everybody individually.
Oh, it's impossible.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that must be so much fun to go back and see your old friends. Wow. Do you have plans to go back again anytime, or just depends?
Just plans. It's a lot of fun. And now I'm
Yeah.
sort of semi-retired.
Yeah.
Well,
Oh, do you?
I don't know when.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But I'm pissed off.
Oh, oh, great, great. Does she wanted to come sit? Did she have class Tuesday night?
Yeah, Tuesday night, but last week I taught the class.
Oh, you
This
taught.
week was Wednesday.
Okay.
She always speaks.
Because she's going to come see me, and she said Tuesday afternoon, and then it occurred to me that she wants to come see me before the class, like, because she teaches regularly. And then I really want to go see her rabbit. I'm so interested. I know. In fact, we were going to get together today, but it must be next Friday. She said something about Friday, and I thought it was today, but it must be Friday. But yeah, so following the whole story in Tricycle magazine, there was an article. In Tricycle magazine.
Oh, really?
I know this one. Go ahead.
Yeah, they interviewed her. And there's a story. She put it on the rabbit Facebook
This
page.
rates of keen building.
You know, the rabbits have their own kind of
But they pay $70,000.
She put the
to have
tricycle.
somebody expedite.
But her story.
I have been so busy, I haven't been fun.
Yeah, I know, and we were really old friends. I think I met her when she first moved to the U.S., which is like 24 years ago now. I met her way back then, you know, when she was she's great.
I met her here. I started coming to yoga class.
Oh,
And one day I decided that I would
yeah.
and she was the one who
Kind of
me out to
encouraged you.
yeah, and after I graduated, you know, you always have this fear, like
Oh,
fear,
yeah.
and she was going, we're going on vacation, we can't be talking. I said, no way, I'm not doing it, no, oh yes, you're ready, you're doing it.
Oh.
And she just
Kind
made
of
me
pushed you.
yeah,
Oh.
and I'm very
Oh,
thankful for
great.
that.
Yeah. Oh, well, sometimes you need a teacher like that, who like knows what you're ready for, even in the way that you don't know. And you would never do it, and then somebody
It would
else.
have taken me another year to just go for it,
Yeah,
and she just
yeah.
forced me to do that.
Oh, good. Yeah, yeah, no, she's great. She's very enthusiastic. You know, really cares about you. And what's your name? Nini's? Yeah, nice to meet you. Yeah. Were you here when I was here before? A year and a half ago. You were. Where's your dad? Yeah, I remember you. I remember a couple of other people. Yeah, it was, the weather was bad. I remember this. That was wild. Yeah.
I lived in Misawa, Japan for 4 years when I was in the military.
Oh my God. Yeah, I was shocked. I mean, I was living in Canada where it was cold, but it didn't. No, I'm good. I'm good. Thanks. I think I've got enough. Yeah, I've got enough water. Yeah. I'll round them back up.
A couple of people complain it's a little warm in here.
Yeah.
The windows okay?
Yeah, that's. I can feel a nice breeze now. Yeah, it was getting pretty steamy. All the body heat. Okay, we'll start up again. I don't have my bell. Ding, ding, ding. Oh, there. All right, so before we carry on, any questions so far about ignorance or the mental afflictions? Yes?
Actually, in the beginning, before we even started, the prayer that you recited as you were doing the prostration, I haven't heard that before.
Oh, it's a prostration mantra, and do we have that in the, do you have the 35 Buddhist prostrations in this one? Oh, okay. It's not in the, so, do you? It's not in this one. So it's a mantra that's supposed to multiply the benefits of doing the prostration. So we say often with prostrations that we prostrate with body, speech, and mind, right? So you do the physical prostration, the physical bows, whether it's the full one or just kind of bowing. And then mentally, you're meant to generate kind of a sense of respect in your mind. And then that mantra is a way to make prostrations with the speech. And so it's means something like I bow down to the great one, the great blissful one, something like that. You know, it's verbally through a mantra bowing down to the Buddha. So we usually do that when we make prostrations, is recite that mantra while we're doing those 3 prostrations. Yeah, so it was. So there's a practice called prostrations to the 35 Buddhas, and it's a practice where you do prostrations while you're reciting the Buddha's names. We'll talk about it tomorrow because it's one of the traditional purification practices. Tomorrow, after we talk about karma, I'm not just going to give you the bad news. I'm going to teach you how to purify karma, because I wouldn't just be like, oh, well, you've messed up, right? So I'm going to teach you how to purify. And then there's 6 traditional practices and then some creative ones, and we'll talk about all of those. And one of the traditional ones that we do a lot is these prostrations while reciting the names of the 35 Buddhas. We do that practice a lot, like Lama Zopa Rinpoche really recommends that we do it when we're doing retreats especially. So sometimes if you do a residential group retreat, you'll do that practice. When you do a retreat with Lama Zopa, you do that practice before every session, mostly, because it's such a powerful practice. But it starts with a couple of mantras, and then you start reciting the names of these 35 Buddhas while we're doing. We might look at it, because we got some time this weekend. We might take a look. Even if we don't do the whole practice, we might just pull out the prayer book and just, you know, I can show you where that practice is if you want to do it. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking. All right, any other questions about what we've talked about so far? The ignorance or the mental afflictions, definitions, anything at all? Don't be shy. Yeah, we good? All right. So then those mental afflictions can lead to karmic actions. And I put here the 10 non-virtues. If you don't know what that is, don't worry. We're going to go over those in a lot of detail. It doesn't cover everything that's considered to be non-virtuous, but it is a list that the Buddha taught that covers a lot of territory, and then we can kind of extrapolate from there. And remember again that, this is a little bit redundant because karma really does mean action. That's what the literal translation of the word in Sanskrit. But this is to emphasize that, the karma is the imprint in our minds that's caused by doing the action. Then later on it ripens into a result, right? So the karma doesn't refer to the result, it refers to that imprint in our mind. And this is another important thing to keep in mind, because I think a lot of times those of us who were raised in Western culture, especially Judeo-Christian culture, you have this idea, and some people really kind of freak out, to be honest, when we are studying the Four Noble Truths and we get to karma and I start talking about cause and effect and the results of your negative actions, people sometimes freak out and say, oh no, that's just like the judgment and punishment of that religion of my upbringing. And they really have a lot of resistance to the idea of karma. For one thing, in Buddhism, there's nobody to judge. There is no supreme being judging you, right? And it's not that you're being punished for anything. It's just that you've created a cause which then will give you a certain experience if you haven't purified that imprint. And it's just like, I think it's Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. It's as impersonal as the laws of physics, right? And so that's something to really keep in mind, because even when I say that over and over and over again, people are like, oh, but I'm being punished because I was bad. And I'm like, forget about judgment, forget about punishment. But it's hard for us, because a lot of us grew up with that culture, right? So you have to kind of constantly be reminding yourself that it's about, just creating a cause, just like physics, for the equal and opposite reaction to happen, but it's all happening mentally. And so usually we talk about karma as imprints in the mind. Sometimes we talk about karmic seeds. Remember, in the time of Lord Buddha, it was a very agricultural society, so there are all these agricultural metaphors that the people really understood. And even though we're not farmers, we still understand planting a seed, watering the seed sprouting, so those are the kind of metaphors that we use when we talk about Buddhism. But it's an imprint in our mind, and then that karmic seed goes along as a latency or a potential until it meets with the right conditions to sprout and give you an experience, right? And we'll talk about the results of karma too. We'll talk about the results of the 10 non-virtues. But keep that in mind. It's a mental imprint. It's carried in the privacy of your own mind. Nobody else knows. Nobody's punishing you. Nobody knows that you've done the thing. I was talking to a Zen monk once about karma and things that are considered to be naturally non-virtuous, because there are certain things that are non-virtuous if you've taken a vow not to do them, right? So for me as a monastic, there are certain things that are non-virtuous for me that aren't non-virtuous for you guys at all, because they're not naturally non-virtuous, they're just proscribed because of my vows. But then there are things like killing another being, that's considered to be a natural non-virtue. Whether you've taken a vow not to kill or not, that's one of the things that's considered to be non-virtuous for everyone. And I was talking to this Zen monk, and we were talking about, why is that there's this class of things that are natural non-virtues? And he gave this interesting explanation I like a lot. And he said, it's because we have Buddha nature. Because by nature, our mind and our consciousness is pure, and it has this sort of potential for perfect compassion, wisdom, kindness. That is our ultimate nature. And he said, anytime we go against that, really do something against, it's like we're warping our nature in a way that creates this sort of kink in our mind stream. And then that's the thing that will give us an unwanted experience. And I kind of thought that was an interesting way of looking at it, is like these natural non-virtues we're actually going against something about our own nature. And working in maximum security prisons, the number of years that I have, it's really true. Those guys have done things, even if they talk themselves out of it, when they did that dumb thing they did when they were 21 years old, because that's usually the story, and then because of the prison sentences in America, 50 years later, they're still in there. But they know, and they knew even at the time, something overrode that because they were part of a gang or peer pressure or whatever it is. But they always say, yeah, I knew it was wrong. I know, even in the moment, always there's that thing of our natural, we know, that we're doing something that's against that true nature. And so it makes sense then that those things would be considered to be naturally non-virtuous. I think we have to override, and I think that's military training. A lot of boot camp is overriding our natural reluctance to do those kind of things, I think. From what I've heard, it's like it takes a lot of energy to override that. A lot of training to go against those kind of natural tendencies. So that's, karma is not being punished. Nobody else is keeping track. It's sort of this little warp in our mind streams that causes us to have a certain experience. And so we'll talk about that. Yes?
Just a question about the definition of karma.
Yeah.
Is the definition inclusive of it being an action and also an imprint? Or is it more the action?
It's more about the action that leaves the imprint. So we kind of say the karma is the actual, like it says here in that verse, that the karma is intention, and what it produces, intention is mental karma. What it gives rise to is karma of the body and of speech. So it's the action that then leaves that imprint. So we usually talk about the karmic imprint being what's left as a result of that action. And sometimes the words are used a little more loosely than that, but like if we're strictly speaking, the karma refers to the action that leaves the imprint, which then gives us the result when the right conditions all come together. Yeah, good. All right. So this is kind of the train of causation. This is the chain reaction, right, causing our suffering. This is the way that it works in terms of causation. But it's interesting, I think, in terms of our Buddhist practice, we work kind of from the bottom up. And think about it. So I think it's interesting to look at this simple diagram and chain reaction, which basically explains all of our Buddhist practices. And to understand why we're doing what we're doing, think about it in relation to this diagram. For example, in Buddhism, we have all of these vowed morality, right? We have lay vows, we have monastic vows, we have bodhisattva vows, another level of vows, we have vajrayana, tantric vows, other kinds of vowed morality, or even if you haven't taken any vows, there's the suggestion to avoid the 10 non-virtues, even if you don't have any level of formal vows that you've taken. And that short circuits this train reaction here. If you don't create the karmic action, you're not going to have the suffering result, right? So by watching our actions, we short circuit at this point. And that's easier to watch our actions and be mindful of our actions than it is to control our minds, right? So you can have a mind filled with aversion, but it's easier to control yourself from punching somebody in the face than it is to control your mind from being angry. That's the next step, is subduing your mind, right? Did you have a question, Ed?
The motivating karma,
Yeah,
the wanting to punch somebody in the face,
yeah,
without actually punching,
yes,
it just stays in your mind.
yeah.
Does that create a karmic seed as well?
So we say that's an interesting one. One of the 10 non-virtues is maliciousness or ill will. So we say that is considered a karmic action. It is considered one of the 10 non-virtues. It isn't just aversion, but we say, and we'll talk about when those 10 non-virtues are complete in terms of having the complete result. We say maliciousness is completed when you decide to punch him in the face. You haven't done it yet. It's not just the impulse, oh, I'd like to punch that guy, but it's when you decide, oh, next time I see him, I'm going to do it. That's when you have a complete maliciousness karma, right? But it's more, it's kind of interesting because it's not the action, the bodily action of punching in the face, but it's not just simply a mental affliction of aversion. It's heavier than that. And it has its own karmic results. And we'll look at that tomorrow. We'll look at the specific karmic results of all those 10 non-virtues. So something could be an incomplete killing karma, but a complete maliciousness karma, right? So you haven't completed the act of harm towards the other being, but you decided to do it, so you have a complete maliciousness and an incomplete killing karma. So we'll look at that. But yeah, that would be that one. That would be that one. And when, I don't want to skip ahead. We'll get to that. It's so cool, but we'll wait on that one. So subduing our actions, still hard, right? But easier than subduing our minds, right? The attachment and aversion and the jealousy and the pride. And sometimes, especially at the beginning of the path, it's all we can do to just try and avoid these. And your mind is still a mess, isn't it? Even well onto the path, your mind can still be a mess. But then we work, and there's many, many meditations to deal with subduing our mental afflictions. And some of you may have done in your Buddhist teaching, some of you that have studied specific analytical meditations, antidotes to anger, antidotes to attachment, and we'll try and see if we've got time to do some of those. Then, this ignorance, this basic, as Doug was explaining, this basic misperception about how things exist, that's a tough nut to crack, right? That's hard, doable, but it's subtle. And it takes a lot of meditation, a lot of studying just to get clear about how to do it. Lots and lots of meditation to right that wrong perception and get it correct, right? So this is even subtler still. So even though this is sort of the direction that it's caused, in our practice we kind of go backwards. And you find there's this interesting kind of feedback loop. The more you subdue your actions, your mind becomes more subdued, right? And then the more you subdue your mind, the more you're able to meditate really deeply and well on emptiness. So there's this interesting feedback loop. And sometimes in Buddhism, we talk about the 3 higher trainings, and that's really emphasized in the Pali tradition and the Theravadan tradition. Ethics, concentration, and wisdom are the 3 higher trainings. And we say, having a really good basis of ethics enables you to meditate really well. You can develop good concentration. Sit down with a mind filled with regret, because you're going around treating people bad all the time. You're not going to be able to meditate well. I'm a veteran of that kind of messed up meditation that you sit down on the cushion, you're like, oh, gosh, I said that thing to that person, and I talked about that one behind their back, and right? So hard to meditate well. So ethics as a foundation for concentration. And then in order to actually see things directly the way they really exist, we're going to talk about that a lot on Sunday, having a direct realization of emptiness or a direct realization of the ultimate nature of reality, we have to have perfect concentration for that, right? As a platform for really directly seeing the ultimate nature of reality, the platform of a really well-subdued mind and perfect concentration. So you can see how they kind of build on each other. So in this kind of feedback loop. So we start here, it's easier. We work on all 3 levels kind of simultaneously, but it is really easier to subdue our actions. And I find when I do this, and tomorrow we're going to do a karma quiz, as I said, to see what the causes are of the experiences that we're having now. It's kind of like Jeopardy, where they give you the answer and then you guess the question. It's kind of a little bit like karmic Jeopardy. I should rename the quiz. But I find, then we can really become mindful of our actions and really start to subdue those actions when they arise. Because these are just bad habits. It's not that we're horrible, terrible people. In fact, we have this beautiful Buddha nature. It's just that we have a lot of ignorance that we have to deal with. That's all. You know, it sounds really easy when I say it like that, but karmic actions. And then you notice the kickback effect on your mind. I'll give an example. One of the things about being a Buddhist teacher, you get to confess publicly in front of the whole class. So when I was growing up, the people I hung out with, we sort of thought we were being really witty and funny and smart when we talked about people behind their backs, right? Dissed people, made fun of them. We thought that was hilarious. It got to the point, it was such a bad habit. I remember once sitting with my friends, and people were just walking down the street. And it was like, look at her hair, and oh my God, you know, this terrible, I mean, it was just a terrible habit, and we thought we were so funny and witty. So anyway, I had this bad habit, and then I became a Buddhist and started meditating, and at a certain point I was like, this is really bad. Like, I have this habit, and it still, you know, pops up, and I was like, so non-virtuous, just ugly. Like, at a certain point, it was sort of the princess and the pea. I'd gotten really sensitive to this thing that I did, and it was like, ooh, you know, I really, so I'm trying to think of like, how can I change this bad habit? And I said, I came across a technique, and I go, okay, every time I diss somebody, I'm going to say something really nice about them immediately. You know, that'll cure me. So I'm saying these schizophrenic sentences, and my friends all think I'm crazy because I'm like, oh my God, that guy is such a jerk. And he's so devoted to Lama Zopa. And my friends are all like, oh, what? But it really, and at first it was so effortful that I had to really try to think of the antidote, but then it was amazing. After a while, it became easier and easier to think of the good quality, and sometimes I'd even think of that first, right? And it really subdued my mental affliction of that kind of divisive, snarky comments. Until then, I mean, I can't say I'm completely cured, but wow, I've made progress. And sometimes we have to do that. We apply an antidote super effortfully, and it just feels so contrived, but you just keep at it, and it really works. A student told me once that it only takes 28 days to either get a new habit or break an old one. That's less than a month. That's so optimistic, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't take long, and if you're really kind of assiduous at your practice, and it really does. One friend of mine who's a Buddhist teacher talks about the bliss of blamelessness, and I love that. And he says, you know, if you're leading an ethical life, your mind is just so sweet, you know, and it's really subdued, and then you sit down to meditate, and you know, it's a lot easier, and it's more peaceful, and it just goes really, really smoothly. So this is kind of the direction that we work on, and I think it's really helpful to think of all of our Buddhist practices in the context of where are we short-circuiting, you know, this chain reaction. Because for us, actually, as educated people, it doesn't really work for us to do it because Lama Zopa told us to. You know, and the Tibetan Lamas say that. I had a teacher at Kensur Jumpa Tekchog, and he used to always say, you guys are educated. You need to understand why. He goes, you guys, it's not good enough for you guys to go, oh, you just do it because I told you so. So he goes, I'm never going to do that. I'm going to explain to you why. And it's really true, isn't it? So try and relate all of the practices that you do to where are we short-circuiting, because then that's all that the Buddha taught was eliminate this. So this really explains the whole Buddhist path. You know, the fourth noble truth is really about, you know, where are we short-circuiting in this diagram. So it's kind of cool. Doug, you had a question.
Actually, I just wanted to kind of point out, the way you were explaining everything just reminded me of why I actually chose Tibetan Buddhism in the first place.
Yeah.
Time to share.
Yeah, please do.
You know, I've been practicing Buddhism for years, and the Tibetan system in particular seemed to really coincide with my knowledge on neuroplasticity.
Oh, yeah.
The ability to rewire
That's right.
your own brain.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're talking
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's really true. I mean, it's very, very cool because a lot of the research is bearing out how Buddhism works. Like, how does our meditation work? Exactly. It's like, and then they put Mathieu Ricard in the fMRI, and like his left frontal lobe lights up when he meditates on compassion. It's like, oh, that's what's happening when I do my compassion meditation. I didn't know that all the blood is rushing to my left frontal lobe, but it is. It's really cool. We're just rewiring the whole system through our meditation practice, which is why we really do need to meditate and really practice, because, you know, it's great to hear me up here go blah, 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 and it all makes sense, and isn't that cool? But to do that rewiring thing really does depend on your rear end being in direct contact with the meditation cushion. Yeah, yeah. And just do that.
That's the very beginning of it.
That's right.
Comfortable with it.
So don't worry about feeling contrived about it. It will be for a while. You're not being a hypocrite. It's just the first step of retraining is, you know, just be nice even when you don't feel like it. Fake it. You know, fake your compassion. Don't fake it forever, but, you know, you use that, and then you really do fine. Yeah, great. And I'm so glad that you mentioned neuroplasticity, because it really is, like I say, it's funny because I've been teaching this class on Wednesday and Thursday nights, Cultivating Emotional Balance, and I said after that course was developed, one of the people that developed it was an emotions researcher, and he insisted there be a double-blind, controlled study, you know, at the cost of like that. I go, wow, I never needed that for Buddhism. I just figure, okay, if it's produced beings like His Holiness for 2,600 years, like that's good enough of a double-blind study for me. But it is really cool when science is validating and showing us different ways of explaining how our practice really works. Yeah, yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Anything else? Yes. And tell me your name. Chanel. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Our thoughts do leave imprints, but it's not a full karmic action. We'll start talking, let's see, how much time do we have? We'll talk a little bit, we're going to start talking about the laws of karma, and then I think we won't get there tonight, but tomorrow morning we'll talk about the 4 components that make a complete karmic action, so that we'll experience the full result of that karma. And I think that'll help answer your question. There's 4 parts to it, and some of them might be missing, and in which case we're not going to experience the full result of that. So it may not be a full ill will or maliciousness karma. Even the thought has to be taken to quite an extreme before we'll experience that full result of that. But if you hold off until the morning, we'll get to that list, and I think that'll help answer your question of, have I done it all the way or not, kind of thing. Yeah, and what's your name? Chris, yeah.
I come from a 12-step background.
Yeah.
And I love what you're talking about. You know, we have a phrase, fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
And also that right actions lead to right thinking.
Yeah.
But I was always confused about, you know, if I'm trying to help somebody, but
Yeah.
I'm still in ignorance, and I'm still in delusion.
Yeah.
That the fact that, you know, I might be hurting somebody, you know, with the idea that even though I'm still trying to help, but maybe I'm doing it out of, you know, grasping for attention or grasping
Right.
for helpful identity, right?
Yeah.
I'm really confused about that, you know, do I have to correct my thinking before I
Mm.
help somebody else, right?
Yeah. And in Buddhism we say, we try to be super clear about our motivation, right? Before we engage in even a virtuous action, we always talk about correcting our motivation, really checking, is it ego? Is it so they'll think I'm a hero? Like, what's going on with my motivation? To try and get it as purely altruistic as possible. knowing, actually according to Buddhism, we say, we don't have a purely altruistic thought until we've seen the ultimate nature of reality directly, which gives us a lot of leeway, because like most of us aren't there yet. But we try and correct, knowing that there's going to be selfishness in there for sure, right? Because we still have that wrong view of how we exist, so there's going to be some selfishness. So we try and correct, but we also don't go to the other extreme of sort of sitting on our hands until we're enlightened and not doing anything because we don't know the total ramifications. We say, correct your motivation, bring as much wisdom, whatever wisdom you have, to bear on the situation, and then go ahead and act, knowing that it may not produce the result that you want, but we say it's like pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. If we never engage in helping actions, if we just wait until we're enlightened, we're not going to create the causes for enlightenment. So it's like we're shooting ourselves in the foot if we wait forever until we have perfect wisdom, because part of creating the cause for perfect wisdom is, you know, doing those actions of service and of helping people. But we do try and really, really, you know, there's a thing, anybody who kind of was around in the 80s, we talked about being codependent, you know, and enabling, which they talk about a lot in 12-step. And that's something that a lot of people that are involved in spiritual practice, I often talk about myself being, you know, in recovery from being a black belt codependent. I mean, completely black belt, like totally so into that. And it was all, but we say that even when you're doing that enabling behavior, it might look like you're helping someone, but it's really still all about you. So if you can be clear that, oh, I'm doing this because I have such low self-esteem that I have to be taking care of everybody in my life so I won't feel like a total waste of oxygen. If you're clear about that, then you're like, you're looking, is it really helpful or not? I mean, I used to be in intimate relationships characterized by black belt codependency on my part, you know, another confession. Was I helping the other person? No, I was just enabling them to be totally dysfunctional. It wasn't real compassion because it wasn't really, didn't have any wisdom in there at all about what was best for them. But having said all of that, we don't wait until we're perfectly compassionate and wise, because that'll never happen if we don't do any of those actions. But I think, you know, what you say, just try and be as aware as possible. And if it's really confusing, just wait, hold off. Sometimes the most compassionate thing to do is wait. The person isn't even ready to be helped yet. And it's really hard. You have to like sit back. Sometimes the most compassionate thing to do is be wrathful. We talk about wrathful manifestation. It's not anger. It's motivated by compassion, but sometimes you have to be really harsh with people. I have a student in Boulder, Colorado, and I don't see him very often because I don't go there much anymore. And whenever I see him, he always is like, God, you're so harsh. You're always yelling at me. And I'm like, well, you keep doing the same stupid things year after year. You know, he needs that. He needs me to straighten him out a little bit harshly. Apparently Lama Yeshe used to do that. And then he'd have to yell at people, and then he'd go to his room and cry because he'd have to like yell at people because that's really what they needed. So compassion isn't just rolling over and being a doormat and doing what people want. And that's important, you know, but it's tricky. It is tricky. And sometimes we feel like, well, gosh, I don't know if I have any wisdom at all to bring to bear on the situation. And then sometimes you wait until it's more clear and really check that impulse to just jump in, which might be interference, which might be enabling, right? So it's tricky. It's like the wisdom and the compassion need to be balanced, and it's kind of hard to get the balance right, but we say such a big part of the karmic imprint for us is our motivation. So really, really spending a lot of time getting clear about, you know, what our intention is and trying to get it as pure and as altruistic as possible. Yeah, great question. Big story. You know, I do workshops, you know, we could do the whole weekend on like compassion burnout. You know, because that's a big one, and like people in the helping professions, or just all of us who are going around like caring about other people. How do we get that balance of caring and helping right without getting burned out or just like I can't deal at all with anything and I'm just going to kind of remove myself. Yeah, yeah. Anything else before we continue? Where are we? Okay, well, I think we'll do one more flip chart page. Yeah, Dan. Yeah. Bob, sorry. Yes, we do. Yeah, until a very high level of realization, in which case, then if it's not tainted at all with any ignorance, we call it the two vast accumulations, and we don't even really use the word karma anymore. So karma almost indicates that there's some ignorance about the way that things exist in there. So we talk about contaminated good karma. It's contaminated by a wrong view, but it's still good karma, and it's the lifting yourself up by your bootstraps thing. We have to start with that. And then at a certain point, when our actions are completely purified of any ignorance, then we use a completely different words for it, and we call it the two vast accumulations of method and wisdom. So we don't even use the K word anymore when you get to that point. Yeah, but we will. And by the way, since we're talking first, and tomorrow morning, mostly, we're going to be focusing on the first two noble truths. I'm sorry, full disclosure, we're going to be mostly talking about karma in negative terms. Then we'll get to talk more about virtue and positive karma. But the laws of karma that I'm going to be explaining apply to both the positive and the negative, or the virtuous and the non-virtuous. They all kind of go along with the same rules and the same components that make a complete karmic action. But first of all, I'll just be emphasizing the negative karma, because that's our first job, is cleaning up the causes of our dukkha, so don't be, discouraged. The Buddha started with the first two noble truths. Luckily there were four, or this religion wouldn't have lasted 2,600 years if the Buddha just said, well, there's suffering and a cause. Sorry, deal. No way. But luckily, we've got the last two, so we'll get more into those as the weekend progresses, so full disclosure. Okay, anything else before we... Yes, and what's your name? Michelle, yeah. There is. There's neutral karma. We won't talk about it much this weekend, but it gives us the background noise of our unenlightened existence. Okay? So, for example, I'm sitting on my desk chair from my room, my room, the room I'm staying in for 2 weeks. It's neither the slightest bit uncomfortable. So my experience is not the result of negative karma, because we say that negative karma results in an unpleasant subjective experience. So this chair is fine, not the slightest bit uncomfortable. However, it may not be the chair that I'd like to read the 7th volume of Harry Potter in, with a thermos of hot chocolate either. It's neutral. It's part of my unenlightened existence, so the subtext of all of it is the ignorance of the way that I'm perceiving myself in the chair and everything else. So it's kind of background noise. So we're always, until high levels of realization, we're always doing things motivated by ignorance at the very least, and that is kind of what creates the background of our unenlightened existence that's neither pleasant nor unpleasant. We talk about karma ripening mostly in terms of feeling, the aggregate of feeling, which has 3 flavors: pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. So virtuous karma results in pleasant feeling tone, non-virtuous karma results in unpleasant, and then the neutral is just sort of baseline ignorance results in that. Yeah, good question, because we didn't talk about those definitions. Can you guys handle one more flip chart page? One more tiny list of our many lists? So in karma, somehow there's the 4 of this and the 4 of that and the 4 of the other things. So we've got a lot of lists of 4, and we'll go through the 4 characteristics of karma, our next list. And this is in your booklet on the top of page 3. So the 4 characteristics, and by the way, these are characteristic both of good karma and negative karma. So both the virtuous and non-virtuous applies to both. Karma is certain, and what this refers to is the correspondence in type between cause and effect. Okay, and as I just defined, Good karma is defined as that which leads to a pleasant subjective experience. Non-virtuous karma is that which leads to an unpleasant subjective experience. You're never going to do something virtuous and get a result that's unpleasant. You're never going to do something non-virtuous and get a pleasant result. We're sometimes fooled by proximity, right? So you go online to make a really nice year-end donation to your favorite nonprofit, and you get up and trip and fall down the stairs, and you go, God, why did that happen? I was just really generous. How come I sprained my ankle? There's no cause and effect relationship between those two things, but we're fooled by proximity, right? John Lennon, instant karma? I'm sorry, John, you're wrong. There's no such thing. There's this really pesky lag period between cause and effect. So you tripping and falling down the stairs and spraining your ankle, according to karma, and this like equals like thing of karma being certain, is because you did some action of harm to some being, maybe even in a past life. Most probably actually in a past life. We say most of our karma doesn't ripen into the result within one lifetime, right? So you wouldn't have even remembered or known what that was. You making the big donation. Now, given that your motivation was altruistic and not just to have your name on the list of donors, because that would make it a little mixed, but let's say it was, as altruistic as possible for us now, is going to result, maybe in a future life, in prosperity for you. Generosity results in prosperity and some, having plenty of what you need to live. The fact that they happen right next to each other, no cause and effect relationship. But we're often fooled by that pesky, proximity. I had a friend who's a Buddhist teacher in New York, and you always get, when you're a Buddhist teacher, you always get the students asking for the papal dispensation to do non-virtue. I don't know what that is. Why are they asking the nun to be non-virtuous for? Like, I don't even want to hear it, and no, you can't. End of story. But anyway, my friend in New York, he taught, and a lot of people lived in these apartments overrun with cockroaches, and so the students would ask for permission to kill the cockroaches. And the way my friend always responded to that was, he said, if when you go to squash the cockroach on the wall, your own ribs started to break, you would not ask me that question. So if we had a direct realization of cause and effect, I think we'd really clean up our acts really fast, right? And I think, like, for example, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, I think he has many, many direct realizations. He totally gets karma, and he tries to get us to transform even the most mundane actions into virtue. Has anybody seen this list that's in the back of the Gold Prayer Book? When you're walking up the stairs, imagine bringing all sentient beings to the upper realms. When you're closing the door, imagine closing the door forever on samsaric rebirths. When you're having a poo, think of purifying everything, all these mundane things. Because he realizes we have so many opportunities to create virtue. Mostly we're wasting all these mundane things because he really realizes, he has that direct realization of karma, which we don't, which is why we try and get away with things, hoping Mr. Karma isn't looking in that moment, or something. And if we really understood, if we could directly see with some kind of clairvoyance the result of our actions, wow, I think our lives would be really different, But that's what that one means. It never fails to be like corresponds with like. There's no way. So if it seems like you just did all of these amazing virtuous things and then what Ed was telling me, he is in a car accident of his new car. It's like that was not the result of all these wonderful things that you're doing to support Kurukulla Center. That's going to bring you another result, which is the reason why good people seem to suffer and the crappy people seem to be doing really, really well. It's that proximity, not to mention any names of public figures, But the truth will out sooner or later, because that's the law of karma, is that it's certain in that way. Okay, any questions about that? That's pretty, yeah, Ed.
Karma is certain, so I'd like
Yeah.
to clarify. If one sort of senses a propensity to do something,
Yeah.
do something easy, like you sense a propensity, so you try to lead a virtuous life. So what you do is you like avoid the secondary conditions, like
Yeah.
you don't go to violence.
Yeah.
That only would prevent the karma from maturing in this life, correct?
We'll get there.
Get to it
Yeah.
trying to get you.
Yeah, let's hold off on that, because I want to talk about causes and conditions and how we work with conditions. But yeah, let's hold off, because we haven't gotten into that part yet. And that really relates to the 12 links, because we'll talk about how do we cut through the 12 links, in different ways. And one way is by avoiding the conditions, but it only works temporarily while we're trying to purify those karmic seeds, right? It's like it can work as a fail-safe measure, stopgap measure or something, but it's not any kind of ultimate measure, because those karmic seeds are still there. But that'll come in, I'll come in a little bit when we talk about the 12 links, yeah. Anything else about that? Karma is certain. And then karma magnifies. This one's a real drag, but it's also true for virtuous karma, not just non-virtuous. So karma magnifies. The longer it is, remember we've got that pesky lag period, and the thing that's even peskier about the lag period in terms of non-virtue is, during that time, the karma magnifies, so the result can be completely out of proportion to the cause. It'll be similar in terms of type, but it could be much, much bigger than the original cause. And one of the ways, I was talking to a friend of mine who had studied in the monasteries in South India, a British monk, about how does that work? And he said, it's kind of like your karmic imprints are being passed from one mind moment to another mind moment. Like we talk about the mind as being this continuum of consciousness with all these moments, the karmic imprints being passed along. So he said, it's like every time that karmic imprint is passed to the next moment, the imprint gets deeper and deeper, right? It gets sort of like DNA replicating, or amoebas dividing or something, and it's like it picks up a head of steam, right, by replicating every mind moment in between the cause and effect. And that was kind of a cool way of explaining like the mechanism of that. I mean, it's just a rough explanation of the mechanism, but it sort of made sense if there's been a long period of time. But it also works for the positive karma too, which is why Lama Zopa is trying to get us to do all those things that are just a slight movement of mind to the virtuous when we're walking up the stairs or shutting the door or cooking our food or whatever. Anytime our mind makes that slight movement of mind towards the virtuous, that can then magnify into a huge result in the future. So that's the good news part of this one. If we don't create the karma, we're not going to experience the result. It's not like 50% of what happens to us is random and 50% is karma, right? Everything that happens in our subjective experience is created by karma. So if we don't create the karma, we're not going to be experiencing the result. And karma doesn't just disappear over time. In fact, it's worse than that. It magnifies, but we can purify. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. So we say, for our karma, if a karmic imprint has been created, there's only one of two options. We experience the result when we meet with the right conditions, and that's what Ed was talking about, or we purify it before that happens. Only two choices. If we've, created a karmic imprint, those are the only two options. It's not like if we forget about it, it just sort of fades away, and in our next life we start out with a clean slate at all. Babies are not born with a clean slate, according to Buddhism. Babies come in with deep pockets loaded with karmic imprints, both the positive and the negative. And they're there until they're either purified or they meet with the right conditions. Okay, so those are the four characteristics of karma. Any questions Annette, do you have a question? Go ahead. Are you sure? Okay. You were starting to, you had that look on your face and your hand was starting to come up. Okay. We'll let Mimi ask her question. Yes.
So, if it magnifies, it would be a good idea to purify soon as you can.
You betcha. Yep. In fact, Lama Zopa Rinpoche is famous for saying, if you understand karma and you know how to do purification practice, you'd be insane not to do purification practice every day. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? That's pretty unambiguous. Yeah. And we're going to...
Do it every day. So I'm like creating a big purification.
I mean, it's great. And we'll talk about purification more tomorrow. And then we'll do together, I mean, luckily we have a little extra time because we don't finish Sunday till 3. We'll do Vajrasattva practice together. I have a simplified version of it that's quite easy. How many people are familiar with Vajrasattva purification practice? Okay, a lot of you have already done it, but we'll go ahead and do it together. And then I'll talk about other ways to purify, other formal practices, and then just things that we can do in our daily lives to purify. But absolutely, you know, because that's the only option. And we've got deep pockets of karma. I mean, we have created the cause. The only difference between us and a Syrian refugee and what they're going through right now is a question of timing. And a lot worse than that. It's like we have the potential for any, I mean, unless you're at a high level of realization, in which case, if you are, thank you so much for coming and pretending to be students, because it keeps me out of trouble this weekend. You could all be Buddha emanations as far as I'm concerned. But until a really high level of realization, we say that we've created the causes for any experience you can imagine, and a lot that you can't even imagine. So there's no reason ever to feel the slightest bit superior or like, oh, you poor thing, that could never happen to me. Because it totally could. We just happen. I mean, everybody in this room is riding on the peak of this completely amazing wave of virtue called a precious human rebirth, which is unbelievable.
I say that I'm afraid of having to pay for everything in the next life, because I always think that
Yeah.
here so many
Yeah.
things going on, and here I have this life that
Yeah.
I can't complain about. So at one point I'm going to start paying for whatever I've done.
But see, the wonderful thing about having the life that you have and your interest in Dharma and the fact that you're here, unlike other people who are just spending all their virtue and not doing anything to charge up the debit card for their next life. I mean, one of my friends who teaches, he says, we're living on the karmic credit card. He says, actually, it's a debit card of some holy being who created the cause for the kind of life that we have with all of the incredible opportunities. And some people, I remember hearing a story once, Lama Zopa Rinpoche was in this big hotel in Europe with this huge dining room, like some of the really massive hotels it was in, like Germany or Switzerland or something. And whenever you're with Lama Zopa in public and he blesses the food, I mean, sometimes it can go on for an hour and a half, like offering the food to every holy being, and you're sitting there. It's happened once when I was with him in a really busy diner in the Upper West Side in New York, and the waiter was just flipping out. And we're just all sitting there, and there's a line down the side, Columbus Avenue, like waiting to get in. But anyway, Venerable Roger, his attendant, was telling me that they're blessing the food in this huge restaurant in this hotel in Europe, and at the end of the hour-long food blessing of offer to His Holiness, unbelievable, amazing, so incredible. Then Lama Zopa kind of looks around the room with like maybe 100 people or more than 100 in it, and he said, we just created more virtue by offering our food than most of these people will create in their entire lives. So that's crazy. Like, if you're born as a human being with all of those opportunities and then you don't do anything to turn it around, then, like you say, you've just wasted this incredible opportunity and you're not going to get another one. So what we have to do with the opportunity that we have, knowing what we know, I mean, not to get crazy and frantic and stressed out about it, but just to try joyfully to go, how awesome is that? I know now how to purify, or at least you will by tomorrow. I know what to do. I know how to purify. I know how to deal with my karma. I can keep charging up that debit card. So hopefully I'll have another precious human rebirth just like the one that I've got now. I mean, that's what I'm hoping in my life, to create the causes. I mean, my life is like perfect. I'm a Buddhist nun. I get to teach Dharma, which you may not have guessed I love to do. I really get off on it. And what a great life. I get to travel around and meet all these cool people. I just hope that I can create enough causes to have another one just like this one and kind of carry on. But yeah, it is just wasting the wonderful opportunity, you know, if we just use it all up without any benefit at all. Yeah, yeah. And that just feels like a really great place to stop with my little cheerleading thing about precious human rebirth. But yeah, and that's why you're here. And it's awesome, you know, and we talk about purification. We also talk about rejoicing, and you really should rejoice that you're interested enough in karma and emptiness and the 12 links that you're here. You know, we don't give ourselves nearly enough credit for the virtue we do. We're always kind of looking at our faults and going, oh, I could have done better there. We need to get in the habit of really rejoicing at the virtue that we do and the, you know, being here in class when you could be doing a million other things, you know. It's really something that it's important to really keep that in mind too. All right, let us dedicate, and I think it's page 57 in this booklet is the dedication prayers, and we'll do the verse at the bottom of page 57 and at the top of page 59. So first, just as I was telling Mimi, and really thinking about even the 2 hours that we've been together tonight, unbelievable virtue. How many people never even hear about the Four Noble Truths? They never hear the details about karma. They don't hear anything about emptiness. The people in this room, you all are in such a tiny, extremely fortunate minority of the human beings on this planet. And with all of the attention that you've paid tonight and your interest in this subject, so much virtue, really incredible. Think of what Lama Zopa said about just blessing the food was more virtue than most of the people in that room would ever generate. And for sure tonight, we've, even in the 2 hours we've been together, generated an amazing amount of virtue. So just reflect for a moment on all that positive energy. And then so it's not wasted in creating a cause for just ordinary temporal happiness, we'll dedicate all of that virtue, put it in the karmic bank account for our future enlightenment. So let's recite these 2 verses together. Through this virtue, may I swiftly, having gained Guru Buddha's state, place each and every sentient being without exception in that state. Precious supreme Bodhi mind, may it where unborn arise, and where born never decline, but increase forevermore. Great. Thank you so much. And see you tomorrow morning. Do you have announcements in it?
I'll be a little late. I have a class in the morning, so
Okay.
it's going to be about a half hour.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. I can't wait. It's so wonderful. It's like,
Thank you.
wow. Definitely jewels, I feel like.
Oh, thank you.
So, yeah, we have a great weekend ahead. Venerable Chogkiy will continue tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And then we have a wonderful potluck plan, and we do ask that everyone bring something to share. We do require that there's no meat, no eggs, no garlic in the food. No radishes. And no radishes. Anything else?
Are onions okay?
No seafood, no meat.
Are onions okay?
Onions?
Onions are okay,
Okay.
no eggs.
Yeah, no eggs. And then, and
foods that are easily, that don't necessarily need to be heated up. I know that's a little hard at this time of year, but it's just a lot easier because we don't have that much time for the potluck. So, like finger sandwiches and whatnot. And
You have to bring your own utensils.
you have to bring your own utensils, but we will have paper plates and cups and plasticware of that should be exclusive. But and then Kimber wanted me to specifically say that everything that comes in needs to go out. So we don't like take we don't take the leftovers.
Pack
like
it
the
in,
fridge and
pack
all
it
that
out.
stuff. You have to take it out with you or have to offer it to somebody who's actually going to take it with them. But that kind of thing. So anyway, thank you so much. Oh, let's see. So I just wanted to also mention that Sunday, the correct times are on the flyer, which is again 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And we'll also be having a potluck on Sunday, and there'll also be an opportunity to offer couches and food offering to wonderful Venerable Chogkiy at that time. So thank you very much for coming, and I know most of you are pretty regular, but I just want to say that we are all volunteer run, and we rely on your support. So if you haven't already, I'm sure you're all incredibly generous and wonderfully supportive. So I would say that if you like the teaching tonight, of course, feel free to any donations would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. Thank
Great.
you, Venerable
Thank
Chogkiy.
you. Drive safe, and I'll see you in the morning.